That pile of glass and twisted metal is what happens when you think the rules don't apply to you, Mr. Davies. Consider it a $5,000 lesson in community standards. Karen stood there on the edge of my property line, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across her face, her floral muumuu fluttering in the morning breeze like a victory flag. She gestured with a dismissive wave of her hand toward the wreckage that, just 12 hours earlier, had been my wife's dream greenhouse. It was a custom-built, cedar-framed sanctuary I had spent 3 months constructing with my own hands, a place for Sarah to cultivate the rare orchids that were her passion and her therapy. Now, it was a crime scene. Shards of tempered glass glittered like cruel diamonds in the grass, the aluminum frame bent into grotesque, unrecognizable shapes as if a giant had simply stomped it into the ground. The scent of crushed cedar and potting soil hung heavy in the air, a funeral dirge for a dream. I just stared at her, the blood roaring in my ears, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles were white. The discipline I'd learned over 20 years as an Army combat engineer was the only thing keeping me from crossing that line and doing something I'd regret. She saw the rage in my eyes and her smirk widened. The board voted. It was an unapproved detached structure. You were warned. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about a rule. This was about power. And she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. If you're watching this, I know you've probably dealt with a power-tripping HOA board member or a neighbor from hell. Do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, and in the comments below, tell me where you're watching from and share your own HOA nightmare story. You are not alone, and trust me, you are going to want to see how this ends. Now let me take you back to how this all started. My name is Mark Davies, and after 2 decades of service, I retired from the Army. My wife, Sarah, had followed me from base to base, from one dusty corner of the world to another, without a single complaint. She put her own career on hold, raised our 2 kids while I was deployed, and held our lives together with grace and steel. When I finally hung up my uniform, I had one mission: to give her the stability and the home she deserved. We found a beautiful property in a quiet, manicured subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. It had a huge backyard, perfect for the one thing Sarah had always dreamed of: a proper greenhouse. She'd studied horticulture, and her ability to bring plants to life was nothing short of magic. For her, it was more than a hobby. It was a way to process the stress and anxiety that came with being a military spouse. The greenhouse was going to be her sanctuary. I spent weeks designing it, sourcing the materials, and poring over the city building codes. I pulled the permits, had the inspections done, and built the entire 12 by 20-foot structure myself. It was a work of art with automated ventilation, a misting system, and custom-built benches. The day it was finished, Sarah cried. She spent every morning in there, surrounded by her orchids and tropical ferns. And for the first time in years, I saw a profound peace settle over her. We were home. What I didn't know was that we had moved into a petty dictatorship, and its queen was our next-door neighbor, the HOA president, Karen Miller. Our first encounter was a week after we moved in. She appeared at our door with a welcome basket and a 3-inch thick binder. "Welcome to Willow Creek," she'd said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "This is our book of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I suggest you read it thoroughly. We take pride in our community's uniformity." The tone was less of a welcome and more of a warning. Over the next few months, the warnings became citations. A notice for leaving our trash bins out 2 hours past the designated time. A fine because the contractor repainting our trim had left a ladder leaning against the house overnight. A formal complaint about the unapproved color of our daughter's bicycle, which was visible from the street. Each notice was delivered with that same condescending smile. I saw it for what it was: a pathetic exercise in control by a woman with nothing better to do. I paid the petty fines, moved the trash bins, and told my daughter to park her bike in the garage, all to keep the peace for Sarah. The greenhouse, however, was different. I had built it to last. It was my gift to her, a symbol of our new life. The first notice about it arrived 3 weeks after it was completed. It was a vaguely worded letter citing a covenant against temporary or unapproved detached structures. I read the binder from cover to cover. The rule was ambiguous, clearly intended for cheap metal sheds, not a permanent, permitted, and professionally inspected structure that added significant value to the property. I wrote a polite letter back to the board explaining the situation, enclosing copies of the city permits and inspection certificates, and formally requesting an architectural review to have it approved. I heard nothing for a month. Then a second notice came, this one more aggressive, demanding the structure be removed within 30 days, or the HOA would take action to remedy the violation at the homeowner's expense. I tried calling Karen. She didn't answer. I left messages. They weren't returned. I went to her house, and she spoke to me through the doorbell camera, telling me the board's decision was final and there was no appeal process. She was lying, of course. The bylaws clearly outlined an appeal and hearing process, but she was counting on me not knowing that. She was counting on me being just another resident she could bully into submission. That was her second mistake. My final attempt at a peaceful resolution was a certified letter, formally requesting a hearing as stipulated in the bylaws. I sent it 2 weeks before the 30-day deadline. The certified mail receipt came back signed by her. Then signed as the deadline came and went. I assumed my formal request had forced her to back down, that she was now trying to figure out her next move within the rules. I was wrong. She wasn't planning on following the rules. She was planning on making an example of me. And that's what led me to that morning, standing in my dew-soaked lawn, staring at the mangled corpse of my wife's sanctuary, while the architect of its destruction gloated from 10 feet away. The lesson she thought she was teaching me wasn't about community standards. It was about absolute power. And I, a man who had faced down threats far more significant than a plus-sized tyrant in a muumuu, was about to teach her a lesson of my own about what happens when you push a quiet, disciplined man too far. The first step in any engagement is to control your emotions and gather intelligence. My initial visceral reaction was to unleash a torrent of rage that would have peeled the paint off her perfectly beige house. But my training kicked in, a cold, clear wave of strategic calm washing over the hot anger. Yelling would accomplish nothing. It would only give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control, making me look like the unreasonable one in the inevitable he said, she said narrative. Instead, I took a deep, steadying breath, the metallic scent of torn aluminum filling my lungs. I pulled out my phone. Without saying a word to her, I started recording, panning slowly across the devastation, capturing every twisted support beam, every jagged piece of glass, the deep ruts in my lawn from the machinery they must have used. I made sure to zoom in on the delicate orchids, now crushed and exposed, their vibrant petals wilting in the morning sun. Then I slowly panned over to Karen, still standing there with that smug look, which began to falter slightly as she realized she was being filmed. "Karen," I said, my voice unnervingly level, "for the record, can you state your name and your position on the HOA board?" Her eyes narrowed. "You know who I am, Mark." "I do," I replied, keeping the phone steady. "But the police might not, and my lawyer will certainly want to hear it from you, so please, state your name and title." The mention of police and lawyers wiped the smirk clean off her face. A flicker of uncertainty, maybe even fear, crossed her features. "I am Karen Miller, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." "And did you, Karen Miller, authorize the destruction of my private property?" I asked, my tone as flat and hard as a granite slab. "The board authorized the removal of an unapproved structure in violation of the covenants," she snapped back, recovering a sliver of her bluster, carefully using the word board to spread the responsibility. "I'm going to need a copy of the board meeting minutes where that vote took place," I said. "I'll also need copies of the 3 written notices of violation required by the bylaws before enforcement action can be taken. And finally, I'll need the name and business license number of the contractor you hired to perform this removal." I could see the gears turning in her head. She was used to residents who yelled or pleaded. She wasn't prepared for a calm, systematic dissection of her authority. She had built her little kingdom on a foundation of bluff and intimidation. And I was calling her bluff by asking for the paperwork, the one thing that can't be easily faked after the fact. "The paperwork is all in order," she sputtered, waving a dismissive hand. "You'll get what you're entitled to." I'm entitled to it now, Karen, I pressed, taking a slow step toward my property line. You're on my property, overseeing the aftermath of a demolition you ordered. You should have that documentation on hand. She took a step back. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to be interrogated by you. She turned and began to waddle back toward her own perfectly manicured lawn. This isn't an interrogation, Karen, I called after her, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet morning air. This is discovery. As she scurried into her house, I stopped recording and immediately dialed 911. I reported a case of felony destruction of property. When the two sheriff's deputies arrived, I was calm and methodical. I showed them the video I'd just taken. I showed them the city permits for the greenhouse, the past inspection reports. I showed them my copy of the certified letter I had sent requesting a formal hearing, along with the signed receipt from the post office proving Karen had received it. I explained that I had followed every city law and had made a good faith effort to resolve the issue through the HOA's own stated procedures. Then I pointed to the wreckage. The value of that structure, including the custom systems and the rare plants inside, is well over $10,000, I told the senior deputy. His expression shifted from bored skepticism to genuine interest. This wasn't a petty neighbor dispute anymore. It was a felony. He walked over to Karen's house. I watched from my porch as he knocked on her door. She came out, all indignant outrage, but the deputy wasn't having it. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could read the body language. Her aggressive posturing slowly deflated under his calm, persistent questioning. She gestured wildly, probably spouting her nonsense about community standards. He just stood there, notepad in hand, occasionally writing something down. After about 15 minutes, he came back over to me. Ma'am claims the HOA board approved it and that they're legally allowed to remove covenant violations, he said, his tone wary. She provided a single violation notice, which she says was the final one. Did she provide the board meeting minutes authorizing the demolition? I asked. The deputy shook his head. No, or the name of the contractor. Said she'd have to get that from the HOA's management company. I knew she was lying. Karen was the management company, in effect. She ran everything. So what happens now? I asked. We'll be filing a report for destruction of property, he said, handing me a card with a case number on it. Frankly, this is a civil matter, but given the value and the questionable documentation on her end, a detective might follow up. My advice, get a lawyer, a good one. I nodded, looking back at the ruins. Sarah still hadn't come outside. She'd seen it from the kitchen window and had simply collapsed into a chair, silent. Seeing her pain was like a hot poker in my gut. This was no longer just about a building. It was about the sanctity of our home, about the peace I had promised my wife. As the deputies left, I knew my next steps. The initial shock had solidified into cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just going to sue Karen, I was going to dismantle her entire empire of petty tyranny, piece by piece, document by document. The war had begun. My first call was to Tom Prescott, a man I'd served with in the 3rd Infantry Division. Tom had left the Army, gone to law school, and now ran a small but fearsome law firm that specialized in, as he put it, fighting for the little guy against bureaucratic bullies. He was exactly who I needed. I sent him the video, the photos, and copies of all my documents. An hour later, he called me back. Mark, this is gold, he said, his voice practically buzzing with righteous indignation. This isn't just a breach of contract. It's malicious destruction of property, abuse of process, and I'm willing to bet a whole lot more. This woman, Karen, she didn't just cross a line, she nuked it from orbit. Tom's energy was infectious, and it reinforced my own resolve. He laid out the strategy. We wouldn't just go after Karen, we'd go after the entire HOA board for breach of fiduciary duty. They had a responsibility to act in good faith, and allowing their president to unilaterally destroy a homeowner's property without due process was a catastrophic failure of that duty. First things first, Tom said, we need to formally demand all records. I want every email, every text message, every meeting minute, every financial statement from the last 2 years. We're going on a fishing expedition, and I guarantee you where there's this much smoke, there's a raging inferno of corruption. While Tom drafted the formal litigation hold and discovery demand letters, my mission was on the ground. I needed to understand the terrain of my new battlefield, the neighborhood. I needed allies. I started by taking a walk, timing it for the late afternoon when people were getting home from work, walking their days, or grabbing their mail. I was calm, friendly, and carried a simple clipboard. My first stop was the house on the other side of me, belonging to an elderly couple, the Hendersons. Mr. Henderson was out trimming his roses. I introduced myself and explained what had happened, my voice steady and factual, avoiding emotional language. He listened, his kind face clouding over with concern. "That woman," he said, shaking his head and lowering his voice. "She's a terror, has been for years, ever since her husband passed and she got on the board. She lives for this." He told me how Karen had fined him $100 for having a garden gnome that was 2 inches taller than the approved lawn ornament height. He'd fought it, and she'd retaliated by measuring the distance between his driveway pavers, claiming they weren't up to code. He eventually gave up and paid, just to make her go away. This was the pattern I was looking for. Not just a single act of malice against me, but a history of abuse. I spent the next 2 days talking to nearly every homeowner on our block and the surrounding 2 streets. The stories poured out. There was Maria, a single mother who had been forced to spend $3,000 to repaint her front door because Karen claimed the original shade of blue had faded beyond the acceptable color palette. There was the young couple, the Garcias, who received weekly fines because their toddler's plastic slide was visible over their back fence. And there was David, a fellow veteran, who had been ordered to remove a small, tasteful flagpole flying the American flag from his front yard because it wasn't on the pre-approved list of yard enhancements. He had refused, and Karen had been waging a campaign of harassment against him ever since, citing him for the length of his grass, the state of his mailbox, anything she could find. With each conversation, the picture became clearer. Karen ruled by fear and attrition. She drowned people in paperwork and fines until they complied or moved away. Many were afraid to speak up, fearing retaliation. But my situation was different. The demolition was a public, undeniable act of aggression. It was an escalation so extreme that it gave others the courage to step out of the shadows. I took meticulous notes on my clipboard, collecting names, dates, and details of each person's grievance. I asked if they would be willing to sign a sworn affidavit about their experiences if it came to that. To my surprise, almost everyone I spoke to who had a story agreed. The fear was still there, but it was being eclipsed by a shared sense of outrage. By the end of the week, I had a dozen documented cases of Karen's abuse of power. I organized them into a neat file, creating a timeline of her reign. It wasn't just about my greenhouse anymore. It was about the Hendersons' gnome, Maria's front door, the Garcias' slide, and David's American flag. My personal battle had become a community crusade. That Saturday, I invited the people I'd spoken with to a barbecue in my backyard. I set up tables and chairs right next to the wreckage of the greenhouse, letting it stand as a stark, silent testament to what was at stake. As neighbors mingled, sharing their stories with each other for the first time, a sense of solidarity began to form. They realized they weren't isolated victims. They were part of a collective. David, the vet with the flagpole, came over to me, a plate of food in his hand. "You know, Mark," he said, looking at the twisted metal, "I've been fighting her on my own for a year. I never thought to rally the troops. You've got a real command presence." "It's what they teach us," I replied. "Never fight alone if you can help it, and always know your enemy." As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, I stood up and addressed the small crowd. I thanked them for coming and for sharing their stories. I laid out my plan, not as a quest for revenge, but as a campaign to restore fairness and transparency to our community. Karen's power, I told them, that it comes from the belief that she is untouchable and that we are all isolated. We're going to prove her wrong on both counts. We're going to use her own rules, the bylaws she loves to quote, against her. We are going to demand the transparency she has denied us, and we are going to do it together. For the first time since this nightmare began, standing there among my new allies, I felt a surge of something more powerful than anger. I felt hope. The battle lines were drawn, and our side was growing stronger. The first official salvo from our side was the legal demand letter drafted by my lawyer, Tom. It was a masterpiece of barely contained legal aggression. A formal 10-page document sent via certified mail to Karen and every other member of the HOA board. It cited specific state statutes governing homeowners associations, which mandated open records and financial transparency. The letter demanded, within the legally stipulated 15 business days, access to a vast trove of documents, all board meeting minutes for the past 3 years, both for public meetings and executive sessions, all financial records, including bank statements, budgets, and records of any special assessments, all correspondence related to covenant violations, not just mine, but for the entire community, and most importantly, any and all documents, invoices, and communications related to the demolition of my property. It was a procedural nuke. We knew Karen had been running the HOA like her own personal fiefdom, likely without proper meetings, votes, or record keeping. The letter was designed to expose that. By demanding everything, we were forcing her to either produce records that didn't exist or admit, by omission, that she had failed to follow any of the legal procedures required of her position. While we waited for the legal clock to tick, our neighborhood alliance began its own ground campaign. Our first target was the HOA's upcoming annual meeting. For years, these meetings had been a joke. Karen would send out a notice at the last possible minute, hold it on a weeknight when most people couldn't attend, and rush through a pre-written agenda. Attendance was usually abysmal, allowing her and her 2 cronies on the board to pass whatever they wanted. We were going to change that. We drafted a simple 1-page flyer. On the top was a clear, shocking photo of my demolished greenhouse. Below it, in big, bold letters, it said, "Is this how our HOA dues are being spent? Your board authorized this without a hearing. What could be next? Your deck, your swing set, your flagpole." The flyer then listed the date, time, and location of the annual meeting, urging every homeowner to attend. It concluded with a simple, powerful question. Isn't it time for transparency and accountability? We didn't editorialize or make personal attacks. We just presented the facts and asked the right questions. David, the veteran with the flagpole, organized our distribution team. We divided up the neighborhood map, and over the course of a single evening, a dozen of us walked our assigned routes, placing a flyer on every single doorstep in Willow Creek Estates. The effect was immediate. The neighborhood Facebook group, which was usually a sleepy forum for lost pets and gardener recommendations, exploded. People were posting pictures of the flyer, asking questions, expressing shock and outrage. Karen, who was an administrator of the group, went into full damage control mode. She started deleting posts, claiming they were spreading misinformation. When she couldn't keep up, she shut down the ability for members to post altogether, a move that only fueled the fire and made her look even more guilty. Her panic was a clear signal that our strategy was working. She was losing control of the narrative. A few days later, I received a package in the mail. It was a thick envelope from the HOA's law firm. It wasn't the documents we had requested. It was a cease and desist letter accusing me of defamation, harassment, and fomenting discord within the community. It demanded I retract the false and misleading statements on the flyer and cease all communication with other homeowners regarding HOA business. It was a classic bully tactic designed to intimidate me into silence. I scanned it and immediately forwarded it to Tom. He called me back laughing. "Oh, this is beautiful, Mark. This is a gift," he said. "She's not just stonewalling our discovery request. She's actively trying to suppress your First Amendment rights. A judge is going to love this. We'll be filing a motion to compel, and this letter will be Exhibit A. It shows her state of mind. It's not about rules, it's about silencing dissent." The 15-day deadline for our records request passed. We received nothing. Just as Tom predicted, we filed a motion to compel with the local court, asking a judge to force the HOA to turn over the documents. We attached Karen's cease and desist letter as evidence of her bad faith. Meanwhile, the date of the annual meeting was approaching. The buzz in the neighborhood was palpable. People who had never once thought about HOA politics were now planning to attend. Our small group of a dozen concerned homeowners had swelled to over 50. We held another meeting in my backyard, this time to prepare our strategy for the annual meeting. We weren't going in there to yell or cause a scene. We were going to be disciplined and organized, just like in a military operation. We elected David to be our spokesperson. We prepared a list of calm, factual questions to ask during the public comment section, each one related to the bylaws and state law. Questions like, can the board please direct us to the section of the public budget that allocated funds for the demolition on Mr. Davies' property? And pursuant to state law, can the board explain why the minutes for the last 4 quarterly meetings have not been made available to homeowners? And could the board provide proof of the director's and officer's insurance policy and confirm if its coverage is still valid given recent actions? Each question was a tactical strike designed to expose their procedural failures without resorting to emotion. We were using their own rule book as a weapon. The night of the meeting, the atmosphere in the community clubhouse was electric. The room, which normally held maybe 10 people, was packed. Over 100 homeowners were crammed inside, standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. When Karen and her 2 board members, a timid-looking man named Gary and a sour-faced woman named Brenda, walked in, their faces fell. They were expecting an empty room and a quick rubber-stamp meeting. What they got was a full-blown rebellion. Karen's eyes scanned the crowd, her gaze filled with venom as she saw me, David, and all the others. She knew this was our doing. She banged the gavel, her voice tight with anger, and called the meeting to order. The battle was about to be joined, not in a courtroom, but right here in the heart of her own crumbling kingdom. The annual meeting began with Karen attempting to steamroll through her pre-planned agenda, her voice unnaturally loud and brittle as she read reports no one cared about. She was trying to project an aura of control, but the sheer number of angry faces staring back at her was clearly rattling her cage. When she finally, reluctantly, opened the floor for the homeowner comment period, David stood up, calm and composed. He had a copy of the HOA bylaws in his hand, with multiple tabs sticking out from the pages. Karen, members of the board, he began, his voice respectful but firm, carrying easily through the silent room. A number of residents have some questions regarding the board's recent activities in adherence to our governing documents. Karen's face tightened into a mask of contempt. We have a lot to get through tonight, so please keep it brief. Of course, David said smoothly. My first question is about the demolition of Mr. Davies' property. Could you please tell the community which line item in the approved annual budget covered the expense for the contractor and associated fees? A murmur went through the crowd. It was a brilliant first question. It wasn't accusatory, it was procedural. Karen stammered, that was a necessary maintenance expense covered under the General Fund for Covenant Enforcement. Thank you, David said, not missing a beat. Could you then point to the meeting minutes, which should be available to all homeowners, where the board voted to approve this specific non-budgeted expenditure? The room was dead silent. All eyes were on Karen. She shuffled some papers, her face turning a blotchy red. Board discussions on enforcement on matters are often held in executive session to protect homeowner privacy, she said, a line that was clearly rehearsed but sounded hollow and evasive. Executive sessions cannot be used to vote on appropriations, David countered, citing the specific bylaw number from his tab copy. All financial decisions must be made and recorded in an open meeting. So, I'll ask again, where is the public record of the vote? The walls were closing in on her. She couldn't produce a document that didn't exist. She glared at David, then at me. We are not going to debate one homeowner's violation all night. This is about your refusal to follow the rules, Mr. Davies, she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at me. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, letting her outburst hang in the air. She had broken the first rule of leadership. She had lost her composure and made it personal. Another homeowner, Maria, the woman who had been forced to repaint her door, stood up. My question is also about finances, she said, her voice shaking slightly but determined. For 3 years, our HOA fees have increased by 5% annually. Yet our community pool has had broken tiles for 2 seasons, and the playground has rusty equipment. Can the board provide a detailed breakdown of where exactly that extra money is going? The other 2 board members, Gary and Brenda, looked like they wanted to be swallowed by the floor. They exchanged nervous glances. They were clearly just figureheads, rubber stamps for whatever Karen wanted. They had no answers. Karen, realizing she was losing the room, tried to regain control. This is not an interrogation. If you have specific complaints, you can submit them in writing to the board, she shouted, banging her gavel. A man from the back of the room yelled, "We have! You never answer!" The meeting devolved from there. One by one, homeowners stood up and asked their questions, the ones we had prepared. Each one was a precise surgical strike at the foundation of Karen's authority, exposing her lack of transparency, her disregard for the bylaws, and her questionable financial management. She had no answers, only anger and deflection. The tipping point came when an older gentleman, an accountant who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, stood up. "I formally move for a vote of no confidence in the current board president and to initiate a recall election as per Article 7, Section 3 of the bylaws," he announced in a loud, clear voice. The room erupted in applause. Karen's face went from red to a pasty white. "That's not in order. You can't do that," she shrieked. "It most certainly is in order," the accountant retorted, holding up his own copy of the bylaws. "It requires a petition signed by 25% of homeowners to trigger the recall process. I believe we can get that right now." People started surging forward, eager to sign the petition he had already printed out. It was a full-blown mutiny. Karen, Brenda, and Gary, in a state of panic, declared the meeting adjourned and practically fled the room. But it was too late. The dam had broken. We stayed for another hour collecting signatures. We got signatures from over half the households in Willow Creek that night. The recall was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. While the community was mobilizing, Tom's legal assault was also paying off. The judge granted our motion to compel, ordering the HOA to turn over all the requested documents within 10 days or face contempt of court charges. The order also stipulated that Karen herself would be personally liable for any legal fees incurred by the delay. Suddenly, she couldn't hide behind the HOA's lawyers anymore. Her own money was on the line. The documents, when they finally arrived, were a mess. It was a disorganized data dump of thousands of emails and a few scattered, incomplete financial statements. It was clear they had never expected anyone to actually read them. But they underestimated me. I've spent countless nights of my life poring over technical manuals and satellite imagery, looking for a single critical detail. This was no different. I spent the next 3 days locked in my home office, fueled by coffee and a cold, burning sense of purpose. I cross-referenced emails, invoices, and bank statements. And then, at 2 o'clock in the morning on the third day, I found it, the smoking gun. It was an invoice from a company called Miller Property Maintenance for emergency covenant remediation. The amount was $7,000, $2,000 more than the actual value of my greenhouse. The address listed for the company was a P.O. box. A quick search of state business records showed that the sole proprietor of Miller Property Maintenance was a man named Frank Miller, Karen's cousin. But that wasn't the best part. I cross-referenced the payment for that invoice on the HOA's bank statement. The check had been cashed, but then I found another email, a frantic one from Brenda, the board treasurer, to Karen. It read, "Karen, the bank statement shows the $7,000 payment to your cousin, but he told me he only billed for $4,000. Where did the other $3,000 go?" Karen's reply, sent an hour later, was chillingly simple. "I handled it. Don't worry about it. It's for the reserve fund." But there was no corresponding $3,000 deposit into the reserve fund account. She hadn't just destroyed my property out of spite. She hadn't just violated the bylaws. She had used the opportunity to embezzle $3,000 from her neighbors. She had committed a felony. I leaned back in my chair, the screen glow illuminating my face. The game had just changed. This was no longer just a civil suit. I was holding proof of criminal fraud. The discovery of Karen's embezzlement transformed our entire strategy. What had started as a fight for my property and then evolved into a community battle for fair governance had now become a criminal matter. My lawyer, Tom, was ecstatic. "This is the kill shot, Mark," he said when I forwarded him the evidence. "Breach of fiduciary duty is one thing. A jury might get lost in the weeds of bylaw interpretation. But embezzlement? That's simple, clean, and utterly damning. Everyone understands theft. Our next move had to be precise. We couldn't just leak the information randomly. That would be messy and could even jeopardize the legal case. We needed to deploy this new weapon with maximum impact. The first step was to inform the authorities. Tom packaged the evidence, the fake invoice, the bank statements, the incriminating email exchange between Karen and Brenda, and sent it directly to the Economic Crimes Unit of the local prosecutor's office. He also sent a copy to the state board that regulated homeowners associations. The second step was to inform the community, but in a controlled, undeniable way. The recall election was already underway. Ballots had been mailed out. We needed to ensure every single homeowner understood exactly who they were voting for. We called for an emergency informational meeting, organized not by the HOA board, but by our Willow Creek Concerned Homeowners Committee. We booked the same clubhouse, and this time we came prepared with a projector and a screen. The turnout was even larger than at the annual meeting. The air was thick with anticipation. Karen didn't show up, but her two cronies, Gary and Brenda, sat in the front row, their faces pale and drawn. They had clearly been backed into a corner, forced to attend to try and save face. David once again acted as our moderator, but this time he turned the floor over to me. I stood before my neighbors, not as a victim, but as an investigator presenting his findings. I calmly and methodically walked them through the evidence. I put the inflated invoice from Miller Property Maintenance up on the screen. Then, put up the state business filing, showing it was owned by Karen's cousin. Gasps rippled through the room. I then displayed the email from Brenda, the treasurer, questioning the $3,000 discrepancy. All eyes in the room darted to Brenda, who looked like she was about to faint. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. The final slide was the HOA bank statement, showing the $7,000 expenditure and the complete absence of any corresponding deposit into the reserve fund. "This isn't about a greenhouse anymore," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of the evidence. "This isn't about petty violations or personality conflicts. This is about a pattern of abuse that culminated in the theft of our collective money. The money we all pay in good faith to maintain our community. She used the destruction of my property as a cover to enrich herself." The room was silent for a moment, and then it erupted. The outrage was visceral. People were on their feet, shouting, demanding answers from Gary and Brenda, who could only sit there, mute and defeated. The accountant who had initiated the recall stood up. "I think this makes our decision in the recall election very clear," he said, his voice booming with authority. "But this goes beyond a recall. I move that we, as a community, demand the immediate resignation of the entire board and authorize the Concerned Homeowners Committee to act as an interim board until a new one can be properly elected." The motion was seconded and passed with a unanimous roar of approval. It was a complete and total revolution. Gary and Brenda resigned on the spot, signing a hastily written letter right there in the clubhouse. Karen's reign was officially over. The next day, 2 detectives from the Economic Crimes Unit showed up at Karen's house. I watched from my window as they spoke with her on her doorstep for nearly half an hour. There was no shouting this time, no indignant posturing from her. Just a quiet, serious conversation that ended with them handing her a card. The official investigation had begun. The fallout was swift and brutal. The HOA's Directors and Officers Insurance Carrier, upon being notified of the criminal investigation, sent a letter stating that under the policy's fraud exclusion clause, they would not cover any legal fees or judgments against Karen related to this matter. She was on her own. She had to hire a criminal defense attorney out of her own pocket, which, as I would later learn, quickly drained her savings. The civil lawsuit we had filed was now a slam dunk. With the undeniable evidence of malice and financial misconduct, Tom filed for a summary judgment. This meant we were asking the judge to rule in our favor without a full trial on the grounds that there were no factual issues in dispute. Karen's lawyer filed a weak response, but it was useless. Her actions were all documented in black and white. While the wheels of justice turned, our interim board got to work. We immediately hired a reputable, independent accounting firm to conduct a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years. We established new transparent procedures for everything, from architectural reviews to violation notices. We posted all meeting minutes and financial reports on a new community website. We were rebuilding trust, one document at a time. The forensic audit uncovered even more. Karen had been using the HOA debit card for personal expenses for years. Groceries, gas, online shopping, all coded as office supplies or landscaping materials. The total amount of her embezzlement was closer to $50,000. The community was reeling, but also unified in a way it had never been before. We were no longer a collection of isolated houses. We were a neighborhood, bonded by a shared crisis and a common purpose. And through it all, in my backyard, a new foundation was being laid. Sarah and I, with input from our new friends and neighbors, had designed a new greenhouse. It was bigger, stronger, and better than the first one. Its construction was a symbol of our collective recovery, a testament to the fact that something beautiful and resilient could rise from the ugliest of wreckage. Karen had tried to tear us down, but she had only made us stronger. The day the judge's ruling on our summary judgment motion arrived was a quiet, overcast Tuesday, exactly 82 days after the demolition. I was in the backyard helping the contractors frame the walls of the new greenhouse when my phone buzzed. It was an email from Tom with the subject line, "Victory." I opened the attached PDF. The legal language was dense, but the conclusion was crystal clear. The judge had granted our motion. We had won. The judgment awarded to us was staggering. The court ordered the HOA and Karen personally, as she was not protected by insurance due to the criminal nature of her actions, to pay for the full replacement cost of the greenhouse, which we had documented at over $12,000, including the specialized equipment. On top of that, the judge awarded us $50,000 in punitive damages for the willful, malicious, and fraudulent nature of the property destruction. Finally, she ordered them to cover all of our legal fees, which had climbed to just over $30,000. The grand total was $92,000. I read the number twice to make sure I wasn't mistaken. $92,000. It was a sum so significant it would almost certainly bankrupt her. The judgment was against both the HOA and Karen, but our interim board, armed with the evidence of her sole culpability and the embezzlement, immediately took action. They negotiated with our lawyer, Tom. The HOA would pay the portion related to the actual greenhouse replacement from its reserve funds, a cost it would have to bear for its failure of oversight. In return, we would agree not to pursue the punitive damages against the community itself, but solely against Karen. This was a strategic move. It allowed the neighborhood to begin healing without a massive financial blow, and it focused the full, crushing weight of the punishment directly on the person responsible. A lien for the remaining $80,000, the punitive damages and legal fees, was placed on Karen's house. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. There was no gloating or celebration, but a quiet, collective sense of relief and vindication. Justice, it turned out, wasn't just a concept, it was a number. And that number was $80,000. Karen's world was collapsing. A week after the civil judgment, the prosecutor's office formally charged her with multiple counts of felony embezzlement and fraud. Her picture was on the local news. The for sale sign in her yard, which had gone up a few weeks prior out of financial desperation, was soon joined by a much more ominous notice from the sheriff's office. A notice of levy indicating the property was being seized to satisfy a legal judgment. She couldn't sell it because we now owned a significant portion of its equity. She couldn't refinance. She was trapped. The new HOA board was elected a week later. David, the veteran with the flagpole, was the unanimous choice for president. Maria, whose front door had started this whole chain of community action, was elected treasurer. The accountant who had called for the recall became the head of the architectural review committee. It was a board made up of the very people Karen had tried to silence. Their first official act was to pass a new bylaw, which we all informally called the Greenhouse Rule. It clarified the process for approving structures, mandating clear written decisions within 30 days, and establishing a fair and impartial appeals process. They also voted to formally censure Karen, banning her from ever serving on a board or committee in the community again, a symbolic but deeply satisfying gesture. As for Sarah, the change in her was remarkable. With the legal battle being handled by Tom and the community support firmly behind us, she began to heal. She threw herself into the design of the new greenhouse, spending hours sketching layouts and researching even more exotic plants. The construction site in our backyard became a place of hope, not a reminder of loss. Neighbors would stop by, offering to help, bringing her small plants to get her started again. The Hendersons gave her a beautiful orchid from their own collection. The Garcia family, their toddler slide now proudly displayed in their yard, brought over a sapling from a lemon tree. The greenhouse was becoming a community project. It was more than just a building, it was a symbol of resilience. One afternoon, as I was installing the new polycarbonate panels, I saw Karen in her yard. She was just standing there, staring at her own house as if she were seeing it for the first time. The perfectly manicured lawn was starting to look a little ragged. The award-winning rose bushes were beginning to wilt. The energy she had poured into controlling everyone else's property was gone, and her own was starting to reflect the neglect. She looked smaller, diminished. The aura of untouchable authority was gone, replaced by the quiet desperation of someone who had lost everything and knew it was entirely her own fault. I didn't feel hatred or even anger anymore. I just felt a profound sense of closure. She had sown the wind, and now she was reaping the whirlwind. The final 90 days had been a masterclass in methodical deconstruction. We had taken Karen's tyrannical power structure, built on fear and a 3-inch binder of rules, and dismantled it piece by piece using the very tools she worshipped: paperwork, procedure, and the letter of the law. The criminal case against her was moving forward, and the evidence was so overwhelming that her lawyer was already trying to negotiate a plea deal. She was facing not just financial ruin, but potential jail time. The community, in the meantime, was flourishing under its new leadership. The atmosphere had changed completely. People were talking to each other, hosting block parties, and working together on community improvement projects. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership and pride. The rusty playground equipment was removed and replaced with a brand new set, paid for by a fund that Maria, our new treasurer, had set up. The pool tiles were repaired. David's American flag flew proudly from his front yard, no longer a symbol of defiance but of community values. The day the new greenhouse was finally finished was a beautiful, sunny Saturday. The structure was magnificent, a gleaming cathedral of glass and cedar. The automated systems were state-of-the-art, and the interior was a lush, green paradise. Sarah was inside, her hands in the soil, a look of unadulterated joy on her face that I hadn't seen in years. Our friends and neighbors, the same ones who had stood with us in our backyard next to the wreckage, were there to celebrate. We had another barbecue, but this one wasn't a council of war. It was a victory celebration. As I stood by the grill, flipping burgers, I looked over at Karen's house. A moving truck was parked in the driveway. The forced sale of her home to satisfy our judgment had gone through. The house had been sold at auction, and the proceeds, after the bank got its share, went directly to us to pay off the lien. She was packing up the last of her belongings, a diminished figure moving in the shadows of her former castle. Later that afternoon, as the party was winding down, she walked across her lawn and stopped at the property line, right where she had stood that fateful morning 90 days earlier. She looked tired and defeated, the smugness completely erased from her features. She just stared at the new greenhouse, a monument to her failure. I walked over, wiping my hands on a towel and waited. "It's bigger than the old one," she said, her voice raspy, devoid of its usual venom. "It is," I replied, my tone neutral. I wasn't going to gloat. The results spoke for themselves. I hope you and your wife enjoy it," she mumbled, the words sounding foreign and difficult for her. It was the closest she would ever come to an apology. I just nodded. I thought about all the anger, the stress, the sleepless nights she had caused us. I thought about Sarah's tears and the violation we had felt. But looking at her now, a woman who had lost her home, her reputation, and her freedom, I felt nothing but a distant, clinical sense of pity. She was the architect of her own destruction. "Every action has a consequence, Karen," I said, my voice calm and final. "You built this. All of it. I didn't mean the greenhouse. I meant the wreckage of her life. She seemed to understand. She gave a short, sharp nod, turned without another word, and walked back to the moving truck. I watched as she climbed into the passenger seat. The truck pulled away from the curb, turned the corner, and was gone. An era of petty tyranny in Willow Creek Estates was officially over. I walked back into the greenhouse. The air was warm and humid, filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. Sarah came over and wrapped her arms around my waist, resting her head on my shoulder. We stood there for a long time looking out at the yard, at the neighborhood that was finally ours, a community that had found its strength by standing together against injustice. My victory wasn't just in the $92,000 judgment or the fact that Karen had lost her house. The real victory was here in this peaceful sanctuary, in the restored harmony of our neighborhood, and in the quiet, triumphant smile on my wife's face. We had taken the ugliest act of malice and transformed it into a foundation for a better future, not just for us, but for everyone in Willow Creek. The lesson was learned, but it was Karen who had paid the tuition.